This happened just a few months ago, but every time I think about it, the hair on the back of my neck stands up. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that basement, and I don't think I'll ever truly understand it. We had just moved into our new home, a modest 2-story house nestled at the edge of town. After years of living in a cramped apartment, my wife Lily and I were thrilled at the prospect of owning our own place. It wasn't the grandest house, but it had character, an old Victorian-style home with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and a cozy feel to it. It was perfect for us. We even had a little yard where our daughter, Sarah, could play. One of the main reasons we fell in love with the house was the basement. It was large, dark, and full of potential. It had an unfinished feel, with old wooden beams and a low ceiling, but that didn't bother me. I imagined it as the perfect space for a home gym or a place to store our old furniture. The previous owners had left behind a few boxes and some old furniture, but nothing unusual, and for the first couple of weeks, everything felt fine. The house was still new to us, and we were busy unpacking, getting the kids settled in, and making sure everything was in order. We spent most of our time in the living room or kitchen, but at night, after Sarah was asleep, I found myself going down into the basement to sort through boxes and get things organized. The basement had this quiet, eerie stillness to it, but I didn't mind. It felt private, like my own little space to escape. It all started one evening when I was down there alone, sifting through an old cardboard box of books. I had just finished putting away the last of the items when something caught my eye, a dark shadow in the corner. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the more I stared at it, the more I realized it was moving. It wasn't a solid figure, just a vague shadow, but it was definitely there. I quickly turned off the flashlight I'd been using, thinking maybe the light had created some weird reflection. But the shadow didn't disappear. It lingered, hovering by the furnace in the far corner of the room. It wasn't moving in any kind of pattern, but it seemed to sway ever so slightly, like something or someone was standing just out of sight. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I felt a sudden chill run through me. I called out to Lily, but the house was quiet, and she didn't answer. I stood frozen for a few seconds, my mind racing to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. Or maybe it was just a shadow cast by something upstairs. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I told myself it was nothing and decided to head back upstairs. I made my way to the stairs and quickly climbed out of the basement, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over me. I didn't tell Lily about it right away because I figured I was just tired and imagining things. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. It felt like it had been watching me, waiting for me to notice it. The next evening, I decided to go back down into the basement and see if it happened again. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an overactive imagination. But as I descended the stairs, I felt that same oppressive weight in the air, the feeling that I wasn't alone. This time I was more prepared. I took a flashlight with me and made sure to keep the light focused on every corner of the basement. I searched through every box, behind the furnace, and even under the old furniture the previous owners had left behind. But there was nothing unusual. The basement was quiet, still, and empty. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, it happened again. The shadow appeared, almost like it had been waiting for me. But this time it was bigger. It was darker, stretching across the wall, and it seemed to shift ever so slightly. I froze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My eyes locked on that shadow, and for a moment, it felt like it was coming closer, like it was reaching out for me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and the air in the basement seemed to grow colder, thicker. My hands began to tremble, and the flashlight flickered in my hand. I quickly turned it off, but the shadow was still there, hanging in the corner like it had a mind of its own. I backed away slowly, every muscle in my body screaming for me to get out. I didn't say a word to Lily when I returned upstairs, but she must have seen the look on my face because she asked me what was wrong. I tried to brush it off, but she could tell I was shaken. For the next few days, the shadow continued to appear. Every time I went down to the basement, I would see it. Sometimes it would be by the furnace, other times near the far wall. It never moved quickly, never reached out to me, but it was always there, watching. One night, I decided I had enough. I couldn't live like this anymore, wondering if I was losing my mind or if something truly was down there. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and made my way to the basement one last time, determined to face whatever it was. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I called out to whatever was down there, "I know you're here," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing. The basement was still, the only sound my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it moving, like it had been waiting for me. I rushed forward, my heart racing. I shone the flashlight directly on the spot where the shadow had always been. The beam of light hit the wall, and for a second, everything was still. There was nothing there, no shadow, no movement. Just the pale yellow light of the flashlight illuminating the bare wall. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But as I turned to leave, I felt something cold and wet brush against my arm. I spun around, but the basement was empty. I turned the light off and ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. After that night, the shadow never came back. But every now and then, when I pass by the basement door, I can feel it. Like it's waiting for me, watching from the darkness. I've stopped going down there at night, and I've made sure to keep the door locked. I don't know what it was, or if I'll ever truly understand it, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still down there, just waiting for the right moment to show itself again. This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We had just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie, looking like something straight out of a dark fantasy story. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. She said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. It seemed like less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning, I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around again, facing away from the house. This time I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son Jimmy? He was a little prankster back then, always up to something, but when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then, one evening I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something: those statues were heavy. Way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block. But that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all of the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police. But as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. I left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Nothing happened the next day or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels, but we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right, maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statue somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident, and I started thinking the nightmare was over. For the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house where the words "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me, I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back toward the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more like this. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day it is when you're tuning in. Drop a comment below and let's connect. We had just moved into our new house, and it was supposed to be the fresh start we had dreamed about for years. After months of house hunting and saving every penny, my wife Emma and I finally found a place that felt right. The house was an old 2-story Victorian on the outskirts of town, with a big front porch and a sprawling backyard. It wasn't perfect, but it had character, something we had always wanted. The previous owners had left it in decent condition, but it needed some work, mainly cosmetic stuff like painting, cleaning, and minor repairs. Nothing that seemed too overwhelming. We were excited, but also overwhelmed by the idea of the work that lay ahead. Moving day came and went in a blur, and soon, the house was filled with boxes, furniture, and the sound of our 2 kids, Mason, who was 8, and Lily, who was 5, running around and making a mess of everything. At first, everything seemed normal. We were settling in, getting to know the creaks and groans of the house as it settled into its new occupants. It wasn't until the 3rd night that things started to get strange. I woke up to the sound of what I thought were whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there listening, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the house. I listened intently, my heart starting to race. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. It was as though someone was talking just out of earshot, murmuring things I couldn't make out. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But the whispers persisted, getting louder as if they were moving through the walls, coming closer to me. I looked at the clock, 3:14 a.m. A chill ran down my spine. I had always been a skeptic about paranormal things, but this felt different. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination or maybe a sound from the house's old pipes. The next morning, I asked Emma if she had heard anything strange during the night. She just looked at me, a little confused, and said, "No, nothing. Why?" I didn't want to worry her, so I said it was nothing, just me being paranoid. But inside, I was already feeling uneasy. That night it happened again. I woke up to the same faint murmurs, this time a little clearer. It sounded like several voices, layered over each other, speaking in hushed tones. I got out of bed and walked down the hallway, listening closely, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was definitely coming from the walls. I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, listening to the whispers as they echoed through the walls, and the sound of my own breathing filled my ears. The more I listened, the more unnerving it became. They were speaking in low, indistinct voices, but there was something about the tone that felt wrong. I wanted to run downstairs, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The whispers grew louder and then, suddenly, stopped. I don't know why I did it, but I walked toward the source of the sound, the walls in the hallway. As I stood with my ear pressed against the cold plaster, the whispers returned louder, clearer, as if they were right beside me. A chill ran up my spine, and I pulled away from the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Could it be something mechanical like pipes or wiring? But no, it felt too deliberate, too personal. There was no way it was just a coincidence. I decided not to tell Emma about it, at least not yet. I didn't want to worry her or make her think I was losing my mind, but I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed for hours, listening to the silence, straining for any sound, but it was quiet. Nothing unusual. The next morning, I told Emma I thought I was hearing things, that maybe I was just exhausted from the move. She was sympathetic, but she brushed it off. "You've been stressed," she said. "You need some rest." I tried to convince myself that she was right, that the stress of moving had gotten to me. But that evening, as we were getting the kids ready for bed, something happened that made my blood run cold. Mason, our 8-year-old, came to us with a worried look on his face. "Mom." "Dad," he said, his voice shaky. "There's someone talking in the walls." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I heard them," he said. "Whispering. Like people are inside the walls. They won't stop talking. I'm scared." Emma and I exchanged a glance, a mixture of confusion and dread crossing both of our faces. We had both been hearing things, but Mason had no reason to make this up. That night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, determined to get to the bottom of this. I walked through the house, shining the light on every corner, every room, searching for anything that could explain the sounds. But there was nothing. No leaks, no unusual noises. Just the same silence that filled the house when we first moved in. I spent hours listening to the walls, walking from room to room, trying to pinpoint the source. But it was always the same whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't until the following night that the whispers changed. They weren't just distant murmurs anymore. This time they were clear, distinct. I could make out words. At first I couldn't understand them, but as I stood in the hallway, the whispers became louder, and then I heard something chilling. "Get out. You're not welcome here." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice wasn't just a whisper, it was clear, angry, like someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I immediately ran upstairs to Emma, heart pounding in my chest. I told her everything. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with wide eyes. I could tell she was scared too, but we didn't know what to do. We called a local priest, someone I thought was just a last resort. He arrived the next day, and after hearing our story, he agreed to bless the house. He told us the house had a history, a dark one. The previous owners had reported strange occurrences, but no one had ever stayed long enough to figure out what was going on. He said it was likely some kind of residual energy, but that didn't make me feel any better. When he left, we felt a brief moment of relief, but it didn't last long. The whispers continued. By now we were desperate. We moved out of the house, temporarily staying with Emma's sister. As we packed, I could feel the presence of whatever was in the walls watching us. The last thing I did before we left was stand in the hallway one final time, staring at the walls, as if challenging whatever had been tormenting us to show itself. I never heard the whispers again, but I don't think I'll ever truly forget them. That night, I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I rushed in, and she was standing by the window, pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each wearing white face coverings. They were dancing in a strange, jerky manner, almost like puppets. We just stood there, frozen in shock, unable to move. It was terrifying. I didn't know what they were trying to do, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife. I yelled at my wife to call the police, and, while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with the knife in my hand. I screamed like a madman and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them, and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have frightened them because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden, out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids and hide, while I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, the people were gone. The police did a thorough search but found no trace of them. That was the last straw for me. I didn't care about the cost. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happened, we would, but that it would likely screw us financially. Luckily, the cameras did their job because those people never came back, and we never had another incident on the property. The scariest part, though, is that we still live in the same house. We never got an explanation for what happened. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted some distance, so we made the move. We don't have kids, and she stopped working years ago, so she was pretty open to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so moving around isn't really an issue for me. We ended up settling in New Mexico. Both of us had lived in rural areas all our lives, so it wasn't too drastic of a change. That was about 3 months ago. We found a fantastic deal on a house way out in the country. It was honestly bigger than we needed, especially since it's just the 2 of us and our black lab Lola. But we figured we'd make use of the extra space and maybe even host some friends in the future. A few months after settling in, I started noticing something strange. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house stayed powered. After a couple of times, I figured I knew what the problem was. I'm an electrician, after all. I thought it would be an easy fix, just rearranging some of the load on the breaker downstairs. Times like that made me glad I knew how to fix things. I hadn't spent much time in the basement since we moved in. We had briefly checked it out when the realtor showed us the place, but I didn't pay much attention. I hadn't even been down there since then. Anyway, I went down to the basement, looking for the main breaker. The place was cluttered and more of a storage room than a usable space. Eventually, I found the breaker and started working on it. After about 10 minutes, I found the load imbalance and planned to fix it when I had more time. At that point, I was about to leave when curiosity got the better of me. Since I was already in the basement, I figured it wouldn't hurt to take a look around. Most of the space was filled with old furniture and junk. I thought about turning it into a usable space but quickly concluded it would be too much work. That's when I noticed something strange. In the far corner, behind a stack of wooden chairs, was a large metal door. It wasn't just any door, it was industrial grade, taller than usual, and looked thick. I walked over to it, and my suspicions were confirmed. It looked like the kind of door that would secure a walk-in safe or a panic room. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I immediately went upstairs and searched through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left us, but none of them worked. I tried about 15 keys, but no luck. I eventually told Taylor about it, and she was just as curious as I was. Somehow she managed to contact the previous owners, and that's when things took a turn from curiosity to concern. They were odd on the phone. They paused between words like they were carefully choosing what to say or trying not to say too much. I wish I had recorded the conversation. When I asked about the door, they went quiet. Eventually, the wife told me it was just a safe room for a tornado. I told her that was great, but we couldn't use it because it was locked. After another pause, she said they lost the key and told us to ignore it. I thought that was strange. They had literally left us keys to every random door, except this one. The way she said it made me feel uneasy, but there was nothing I could do, so we ended the call. Taylor tried to laugh it off, telling me I was overthinking it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally went down to stare at the door, wondering what was behind it. I tried everything I could think of to open it, but the lock was solid. After a week, I gave up but couldn't shake the curiosity. Fast forward to 2 days ago when things took a wild turn. After my wife insisted, I hired a locksmith. He came over and started working on the door. After about 30 minutes, I went down to check on him. He told me that the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I was worried he wouldn't be able to open it, but to my surprise, he managed to crack it. After another half hour, I wish he hadn't. Inside the room, it was set up like a shrine. Old black and white photographs were on the walls, all covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair facing the wall, like someone had spent a lot of time just sitting there, staring at nothing. In one corner was a cot with crumpled blankets, and the whole place smelled stale. Then I noticed the trash, empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had actually been staying down there, and not that long ago. I was dumbfounded. I didn't think the situation could get worse, but of course it did. As I was trying to process it, I noticed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was small and partially hidden by the poor lighting, but it was there. I opened it and found it led to a set of stairs that went to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like such an idiot. I hadn't even thought to check the cellar door when we moved in, assuming it just led to the basement. And all the time we lived here, I'd never opened it. I was stunned. Someone had been living in my house for who knows how long. Things started clicking in my mind. Since moving in, my wife and I had noticed odd things, mostly things going missing. I had just assumed she mislaid them, but this discovery changed everything. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought a dozen times in my head to fully grasp it. I didn't know who they were or why they'd been there, but I sure didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number or didn't want to deal with us. That night, I took heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door. I found a heavy-duty chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. I didn't care what it took. There was no way I was letting anyone back in through that door. The police came, took a full report, and said they would try to contact the previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was horrified and promised to assist the police. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard a loud bang on the front door. Lola started barking like crazy, and we froze, staring at each other, listening. After a few minutes, the banging stopped, but then small rocks began tapping against our bedroom window. Tyler begged me not to look, but I was furious. I grabbed the baseball bat, pulled the curtains aside, and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything. We thought it was over, but I could feel something wasn't right. Then, from downstairs, I heard glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to see two figures running away from the back door. I don't know if they were the same people who had been living here before, but I'm not waiting to find out.